Welcome back to another episode of Vlogs of History. I'm your host, Darius Cousin, and today we're taking a look at cowboys and the Wild West. Deserts, cattle, and horseback riding are usually what one thinks about when thinking about the Old West. The cowboy became an iconic hero, often being portrayed as a brave man who shot guns and rode horses. The question is, does the true cowboy live up to that image? That's what we're going to find out today in Vlogs of History, so let's get to it. When we're talking about the Wild West, we usually refer to a large plain area in Texas. More specifically, we're looking at a period of about 20 years between the years 1866 and 1886. With the American Civil War having just ended and railroads becoming increasingly popular, the Wild West and also Texas became populated. Even though before that it was mostly empty, there were still some natives and also Mexicans living there. That's because up until 1836, Texas actually belonged to Mexico before it officially got its independence. The Mexicans, they were forced to leave the territory and they had to abandon all of their cattle in Texas. The thing was that the Mexicans had a lot of cattle. The cattle remained to be used for local purposes and the extras were being sold in local markets, but nothing more. There was a market for cattle, but not a very big one. The cattle then started to multiply by itself, and with time they grew to about 5 million. In 1861, the Civil War had begun and a lot of Texans left to fight with the Confederate Army. Ultimately, the Confederation lost, and that had a very big negative impact on the cattle industry in the South. With the men being away at war, well, the cattle kept multiplying, and the result was that they had a lot of cattle and no market for it. Coincidentally, around the time that the Civil War was ending, in the North, there was a significant change in the meat industry. This change resulted in a huge demand for cattle up north, especially in Chicago. In Texas, because of the huge supply of cattle, each head was worth about $3, while in Chicago, the same cattle would be worth anywhere from $30 to $40. That's 10 times the amount. The problem was getting it there, of course. I mean, from Texas to Chicago, you kind of have a long way to go. They did have railroads and trains that wanted actually to have more weight put on them. That seems like a good solution, but there was one problem. The closest train station was actually 1,000 miles north from Texas in Alibene, Kansas. Since you actually had no choice but to make the 1,000-mile journey up north, cattle drives became a thing. A cattle drive is actually a very simple concept. So you have cattle in Texas and you want to get it to Chicago, but you have to make the 1,000-mile journey to Kansas and hope that all of your cattle makes it there in one piece. That actually wasn't as easy as it sounds. An average cattle drive would be about 3,000 cattle being transported. Just think about that for a second. 3,000 cattle being transported 1,000 miles up north, that's risky and that's a lot. So who did those long cattle drives? Well, that's where the cowboys actually come into play. Cowboys, as the term suggested, cowboys were actually in charge of driving the cattle up the 1,000-mile journey to Kansas. They did this for money, of course, because they had all of this cattle here, and if they could move it up north, they could sell it for a significantly higher price. Typical cattle drive contained about a dozen cowboys, each having 3 horses to their own. They had a cook and they also had a horse wrangler. Now, the cook was actually a high-status, well-respected member of society, and he also had knowledge of medicine. I mean, they would probably need it. The wrangler was actually a low-status guy, often staying at the back of the drive because that's where all the dust was. The 1,000-mile journey took about 2 months to complete. Cattle had to move at around 15 miles per day and not more, because if you wanted to move the cattle faster, they would lose more weight and they would not be worth as much. They also took many breaks during the day to prevent the cattle from being fatigued, and they had to watch over them 24/7. It was very important to watch them all the time because you really did not want to lose your cattle. Very quickly, this became a very lucrative business in the 20 years or so that it lasted. A lot of profits were to be made from cattle drives. Joseph Mccoy, for example, a livestock trader from Chicago, promised a lot of money for cattle, and he was a very honest man. He always kept his word, gave what he promised, and always provided a win-win situation for both him and the cowboys doing the cattle drives. Now, besides cattle drives, cowboys actually were ranchers who would do normal ranch day-to-day tasks. They dressed a certain way, most often recognized by their hats. They also had custom saddles, and they treated their horses with respect and admiration. They also had their own cowboy code, which includes some things like not being able to wave at a man on a horse. Instead, you actually have to nod to him, and you also have to say howdy to everybody. Also, stealing another man's horse was very badly looked upon because horses were so respected during that time. They were actually considered very sacred to cowboys. Now, horse breaking was the task of actually breaking a horse and domesticating it. During those times, especially during cattle drives, you needed to have trained horses that would be able to outmaneuver the cattle, because remember, the cattle was faster and more agile than the horses. Horses really had to adapt to keep the cattle under control. Remember, we're talking about 3,000 cattle here. That's not very easy to contain. Now, you may be wondering, what happened to the Wild West and the cowboys? What caused this great era to end? As they kept bringing cattle up north, well, eventually the demand up north decreased, and so prices decreased, making it much less profitable. Also, the winter of 1886 to 1887 was so extreme and unpredicted that a lot of cattle and cowboys died. Plus, add on to that the fact that for 20 years they had been constantly moving cattle up north, Well, at one point there just wasn't any cattle left to move. Adding all that up, well, you've got yourself an ending to a very beautiful era of American history. That was it for this week's episode of Vlogs of History. I really do hope you've enjoyed it, and if you did, please leave a like, share it to a friend, and subscribe to be notified when the next episode comes out. Remember, these episodes come out every single Monday, and if you've missed the previous one, I'll leave a link right here. Make sure to check it out, it's very interesting. Also, I do have another show called Vlogs of History After Hours that comes out every single Wednesday, so make sure to check that out too. As always, I'm your host, Darius Causin. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.